A very warm welcome to everybody who has joined us today for UCL Rare Books Club, and this is the 4th week in our series. I am Tabitha Tuckett. I'm the acting head of Rare Books here at UCL Special Collections, and ordinarily we would today be meeting in our Rare Books reading room, and we would be poring over some physical collections, and we would be having a very gentle, informal discussion. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we can't do that today. So we are testing our series online. We're just starting with this, so please bear with us if you have any technical problems. If you get thrown off the session because of Wi-Fi connections or any similar problems, you can just rejoin at any time during the session. The other thing to tell you is that unfortunately, the software we've got available, we can't have live captioning during this session, but we are planning to record it. So if you would like not to be included in the recording, just switch your video off, and you also have the possibility to change the name on your little window on Zoom. A bit more housekeeping. While somebody's speaking, you have the option to set Zoom to speaker view, which will make the person speaking larger on your screen. And the way to do that is to move your cursor to the top right of your screen, and that should reveal an option for speaker view and gallery view. Gallery view will show you everybody's little window, and speaker view will show you the person speaking. I would strongly recommend that for today's talks, because we're very lucky to have 2 speakers who are going to try to show us their physical items in their little window that you see on the screen. So do make that a bit larger if you want to. So we're going to have 2 of this year's finalists speak today, Imogen Grubin and Naomi Oppenheim. And they were finalists in this year's Anthony Davis Book Collecting Prize. Now, anyone who attended our first session in this online series a few weeks ago, actually it was the second session, will have heard the winner, Alexandra Plain, speak about her collection. But we also have 6 finalists, 2 today and 4 who will be speaking in this series on the 11th of August. So please do book to hear their talks as well. And just a little plug, next week we have Chris Fripp, who is going to talk about 19th century publishers' cloth bindings, and he's done some fairly groundbreaking work on that. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to what this competition was all about. We heard Anthony Davis himself, who has set up this prize, speak a couple of weeks ago. But today I'd like to read out to you the aims of the prize, because I think they're very interesting. This prize is open to universities at any students at any London-based university in London. So that's a very wide remit, and we got an astonishing 64 applications this year. Just bear in mind that many of those students were applying from lockdown, from unfamiliar residences, often in different time zones in different countries from all over the world, with a very wide range of collections. So this is what the prize guidelines say. The intention is to encourage collecting, and we expect that applicants' collections will be embryonic, so their size, age and value are irrelevant. What is much more important is the enthusiasm and commitment of the collector, the interest of the theme, and the vision of how the collection will be developed. So what we have with our 6 finalists today and our winner the other week is people who are just starting out on their journey of forming a physical collection, and the competition is open to a collection as small as 8 items. They should be physical items, they can be books, they can be manuscripts, they can be pamphlets and so on. We're going to see a bit of that today. So today we have 2 collections which really are representing I think the gift of the talented collector, which is to spot items which at the time of their production, and possibly even now, are seen as not particularly expensive, often by many people not particularly collectible, in the sense that they're not the ancient treasures that you tend to see in fairly traditional institutional collections. But they are things that absolutely need to be collected today. And perhaps we can have a little bit of discussion. We'll have questions after the 2 talks, so that might be interesting to hear what people's thoughts are. We're going to start with Imogen Grubin. Imogen is an MA in studying for an MA in Victorian Studies at Birkbeck University. And she is talking about books published in the early 20th century, which were specifically popular editions of Victorian literature. She's interested in the bindings, but there's also an interesting political issue here, that these were books which were specifically repackaging the great canon of Victorian literature, already great by then, repackaging these as something accessible to the popular audience in the series and so on. So I'm going to hand over to Imogen now, and she's going to speak for around 15 minutes, and then I'll introduce Naomi Oppenheim and she'll do the same, and then we'll have some questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tabitha. As Tabitha said, I'm studying for an MA in Victorian Studies at Birkbeck. So as you can guess, obviously I'm quite interested in the Victorian era, which is why most of my books in this collection are Victorian. I'm just going to hold it up for you now so you can see them all together. And what is really interesting about them, I think, is how they all look quite similar, but they all look quite different. So it's how different publishers kind of take on the same traditions but make them look slightly different, either for reasons of expense or reasons of beauty or anything like that. And I think that is what is really interesting and what brought me to this collection. And I guess I first started collecting books when I moved to London for my undergraduate degree and discovered Charing Cross Road. I grew up in Newcastle, where there isn't really any second-hand bookshops, and the ones that are, the books are either the same price or they're more expensive than buying them new, so there wasn't really too much point in it. So discovering Charing Cross Road, where there were all these bookshops filled with books, was a revelation. And I will admit, when I first bought the first ones in this, which I'll hold up to you now, which are Collins editions, I did think they were really special, expensive, one of a kind, which is why I bought them, but obviously also because I wanted to read them all. So I'll hold them up for you now. We've got Romola by George Eliot, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, Silas Marner by George Eliot, and Westward Ho by Charles Kingsley. And what's really interesting about these is that they're all published by Collins, but there are obviously quite significant differences between them. So Westward Ho and Silas Marner have this intricate leaf design down the spine, whereas Romola and The Moonstone have this decorative pattern just above and just below the title. And then if we look at the front cover, we can see that Westward Ho has Charles Kingsley's signature on the front, whereas Romola doesn't have anything, it's plain. But what is interesting is if we open them up to look at the title page, just opening Westward Ho now to show it to you, we can see that this is what this one looks like. And then if we look at Romola, we can see that they're actually exactly the same. So despite the differences that there are on the bindings, which may suggest more expense or less expense, inside they're exactly the same book. But what I think drew me to collecting popular editions was when I first bought these and noticed there was no publication date, it intrigued me. So I looked up Collins Clear Type Press, which is what these 4 Collins editions belong to, and saw that they were cheap reproductions of popular novels. These weren't books that were super expensive, that were made to be put high on a shelf and not read. These were accessible for everybody to read and for everybody to enjoy. And they were made specifically to be read. They weren't kind of classed out as you need to have a university degree, you need to have read a lot in order to understand them. And I think, as we saw in Westward Ho as well, these are all illustrated editions. But I think this is particularly relevant for Romola, because this is set in Renaissance Italy. And obviously a lot of readers may not have visited Italy before, may not have seen necessarily the objects that George Eliot saw and which inspired her. So I think it's particularly relevant that this is illustrated by photographs to really give the reader a sense of the place that she's describing and to really help immerse them in the world. And so here they act as an educational tool as well for the reader. And so that is the 4 books that I first started with. And I want to talk now about the next book in my collection, which is the latest one that was published out of these, which is Alma Gantry by Sinclair Lewis. And I just want to compare it to the Collins editions, because I think it's quite interesting, their similarities. So you can see, of course, the Sinclair Lewis is taller than the Collins, but they're both the same shade of red. They both have a design on the spine, and we can see that they both have the author's signature on the front cover as well. And I think there's a few reasons why this edition looks similar to the Collins edition and to the other editions, which I'll talk about slightly later. But if we open up Sinclair Lewis, which I'll show you now, we can see that it was a collected edition published in 1930, which means that this was made as part of a set to look nice on a shelf, to be bought all together, and to really draw your attention to it. But the other thing that's interesting is that this was published by Jonathan Cape, who was a London publisher, and they were one of the first British publishers to actively seek out American literature and publish it in the UK, which is why I think that they've particularly gone for this shade of red and are definitely trying to tie into this tradition to make the books seem more accessible to people who might not have heard of Sinclair Lewis necessarily, and for them to know that they can buy it and that they'll enjoy it, and to kind of trick people into buying it almost, and to make them think that they already know what they're going to get. This idea, though, of a collected edition we can see in my next book, which is an edition of short stories by Saki called The Toys of Peace. And I think it's a very interesting edition. We can see that it's different to the others for a start because it's blue. It does have a decorated spine and it has the author's signature on the front. But it's this author's signature which is what makes this edition quite special and quite troubling in some ways, because Saki was his pen name, that's how he wanted to be known. But this publisher has made the decision to put Saki in quotation marks and have his real name, H.H. Munro, underneath. Not only do they have it underneath on the spine, though, they have H.H. Munro as the autograph on the front cover, and at the bottom they have H.H.M. embossed on the spine, really hammering in that this is H.H. Munro, this isn't Saki, which makes it seem as though this was trying to be a more formal edition of the books, maybe slightly more expensive. This in itself is quite interesting, considering Saki wrote quite comedic stories, fun, light-hearted things, which doesn't really necessarily tie in with the formality of the book itself. But again, if we open this one up, we can see that this was also a collected edition published in 1927, which explains these elements, which make it seem more expensive and more special, because again, they were part of the set, made to look nice, made to give a particular impression. And we can see this impression continuing with the last two books in my collection here, which are also short stories. One collection of short stories by Henry James, and the other one, Island Nights Entertainments by Robert Louis Stevenson. And we can see, if we look at the spines, they have a far more intricate pattern than any of the other ones so far. And on the front, they don't have the author's signature, but they have the whole name of the book embossed onto it, which not only would this have taken more time, and it would have taken more material as well, which means that they probably would have been more expensive. But there's an extra element to this. So the Henry James book, as with the other books in this collection, is bound in cloth, whereas the Robert Louis Stevenson is bound in leather, which makes this copy feel very special, more expensive, I think, again, than the cloth bound ones that we have here. And it's, again, because when you open it, it kind of feels like it molds itself to your hand. The typesetting is quite open and wide to make it easy to read. On the top, it's gilded as well. And if we open it up, we can see that the title page is protected by a piece of tissue paper, which all kind of goes together to make it seem like this was a very special book to be treasured, which is interesting because, again, this wasn't a particularly expensive book. These were all made with varying degrees of expense, but they were all made for people to buy, to make it easy for them to buy and not be out of their reach. And what for me makes these books quite special. Despite the cheapness, they're all made to be beautiful and made to be read. And it's this kind of history behind it, not just the story inside the book, which is why I buy it, but also to see the efforts that publishers kind of went to induce people to buy it. And this history, again, the other nice thing about these books is that I can tell they've all been read before, they've all been enjoyed before. And although I don't like kind of notes down the sides of my pages or any folding over pieces of paper, sometimes when you have an inscription in it, it really adds to kind of the feeling of the book, which we can see in Silas Marner. It says, to Con, with love from Steph, Xmas 1911. So we can see that this was a carefully chosen Christmas present, bought and hopefully treasured and read many times over the years, which adds again to the history of this book. We can see this tradition continue in the Moonstone, where if we open it up, we can see that there is a signature from Jan McJames on the 26th of April 2008. So I think there's something about these books which really speaks to people and makes them want to add their own history to it, whether it's even just by reading it like I do, or by inscribing their name into the front to kind of really add their own history to this book, which I think makes them really special. But to me, I think the most special thing about these books is the fact that you can just walk into a shop. I don't necessarily buy them online because that sort of denotes kind of a more deliberate effort of buying, whereas if I just kind of see them in a bookshop and stumble upon them and see the history for myself of the book and the people that have read them before, the part of London maybe even that I found them in, is what makes them really special. And although, as Tabitha said, these 20th century editions aren't made to be expensive, they aren't meant to have necessarily survived this long, the fact that they have, and the fact that they've clearly all been read many times over the years, I think shows a lot about our reading history and what has been important in publishing from the 20th century onwards.
Thank you very much indeed, Imogen. That's just wonderful. A very loved collection, and I hope that it expands and expands. And you have very, yes, some clapping. Fortunately, you're not able to hear it, but we are clapping you.
Thank you.
I hope that you're able to expand that over the next few years, because am I right that you're just starting out with your collecting?
Yeah, more or less. Definitely always got an eye on more things to buy.
When did you start collecting? Is that so? Have you had some of those for a while? Or?
I think I've had the Collins ones probably for about 6 years or so, and the other 4 I bought in the last kind of year. So it's kind of, yeah, fairly new, a mix of slightly older ones with newer ones, but I've definitely kind of picked up collecting things as I go, and yeah, things that look really, really interesting.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for presenting them to the camera for us. It makes such a difference for us to be able to see the physical collection. Just a couple of points to pick up on that. Those cloth bindings, is that something that Christopher Fripp has done some really groundbreaking work on, and he's going to be talking about his research next week. If anybody attending today is interested in that tradition of cloth bindings, publishers' bindings, the way that developed alongside the leather bindings, that's very interesting. And I love the annotation in Imogen's book there. We also have one of the finalists in our final session on the 11th of August, and she was a finalist from the competition, and she specifically has been collecting books with annotations in like that. So perhaps you, Imogen, and she can have a chat about that later on. So we're going to move on now to Naomi's talk. Just a little bit about the competition. The competition was judged by a panel of judges, which included a representative of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association in the UK, a representative of the Bibliographical Society in the UK, and a representative of Senate House Library, who hosted the prize last year. We're very proud in UCL Library Services to be hosting it this year. And we also had on the judging panel Anthony Davis himself. We were extremely lucky to hear from him talking 2 weeks ago about why he feels it's really crucial that young people continue to collect. And as we've heard Imogen say, that's that joy and serendipity of browsing in the physical bookshop, which many of us will be missing at the moment. It doesn't have to be expensive to form a collection. And if you have a good eye and a good theme, you'll be able to build up a significant collection of things that other people may not in the past have valued, but you and people in the future really value. And without preserving this material, it will get lost. And that brings me to Naomi Oppenheim now. So Naomi is a PhD student at the Institute of the Americas at the University of London. And she is doing a PhD into 20th century Black publishing, which she can tell you more about, I'm sure. But today she's going to talk about her collection, which is themed Dream to Change the World, a Black British publishing collection. And she's been looking at, I think, mid to late 20th century material, which really needs to be preserved, and something that I hope is going to be taken a lot more seriously by collectors in the future. So I'm going to hand over to Naomi, and I think she may also have a second camera on there. Hi, Naomi. Are you?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I will, when I go onto my second camera, I'll try and pin the video. So thanks everyone for coming, and I also want to thank Tabitha and the other judges who've shared their very wise collecting advice with me, and also Helen and Chris for organising today's session. Imogen, it was so interesting to hear about your collection, and I found what you were saying about accessibility and kind of ideas of the popular really interesting, and it's quite, I guess, you know, it's surprising to see that there are some fundamental crossovers between our seemingly very disparate collections. But so today I'll be talking to you about my collection, which I've named Dream to Change the World, a Black British publishing collection. And I wanted to start off with a poem by Martin Carter that was written in 1951 called Looking at Your Hands. So Carter was a Guyanese poet and activist, and there's a line in his poem which reads, Dream to Change the World. And this has been a really important motif within Caribbean and Black publishing for several decades, and it became a catchphrase of John LaRose, who founded New Beacon Books in 1966 along with Sarah White. And it kind of, the phrase really embodies the cultural and political visions that the publishers in the collection fought to realise. And as such, Carter's poem has inspired the naming of this collection. So I'm now going to read Looking at Your Hands. Looking at your hands. No, I will not still my voice. I have too much to claim. If you see me looking at books or coming to your house or walking in the sun, know that I look for fire. I have learnt from books, dear friend, of men dreaming and living and hungering in a room without light, who could not die since death was far too poor, who did not sleep to dream, but dreamed to change the world. And so if you see me looking at your hands, listening when you speak, marching in your ranks, you must know I do not sleep to dream, but dream to change the world. So what exactly do I mean by a Black British publishing collection? From the mid-1960s, people who'd settled in Britain from the Caribbean and Africa began setting up independent and activist publishing houses, though in this collection I largely focus on Caribbean publishers and publishers of Caribbean heritage. And I view this as part of a historical phenomenon of radical publishing in the Caribbean and amongst Caribbean travellers and sojourners to Britain from the early 19th century. Here I'm thinking of Robert Wedderburn, who was the son of a planter father and enslaved mother, who voyaged to Britain aged 16 and became one of Britain's first Black publishers. And in 1824, he published his autobiography, The Horrors of Slavery. So whilst this collection is grounded in post-war publishing cultures, I locate these texts as part of a much longer Black radical tradition. And the first of these post-war publishing houses that I'm interested in collecting was New Beacon Books. And then shortly after this, Allison and Busby was founded in 1967, and then Bogle Louverture Press in 1969, and Carrier in the 1980s. And these really are the kind of main publishers that I'm featuring in my collection so far. And as the reading of Carter's poem suggests, this collection is about showcasing the connections between publishing and activism. And in it, I gather a diverse body of voices, publishers, writers, poets, historians, and activists from the Caribbean, Africa, America, Latin America, and Britain. And the collection is comprised of mostly out-of-print paperbacks, which then chart changes in terms of content, form, distribution, and audience, as well as offering an insight into the breadth of Black British publishing. And I see the publications as echoing socio-political shifts as these communities underwent generational transformations across the critical decades of the 1970s and the 1980s, when a new generation of Black British people were being educated in racist institutions and by ill-informed teachers. And these books are part of the educational and intellectual activism that publishers were engaged in. And the collection includes fiction, non-fiction poetry, children's literature, artwork through the front covers. And through all of these books, they're very kind of varied portrayals of Black lives, people, and histories. And as it continues to grow, the gathering of the books becomes a living archive of Black activism, not only in Britain, but throughout the diaspora. And it's very much a living and a used collection. The books are frequently touched, read, and lent to friends and family. You know, I don't see them as kind of old relics to be locked away in an archive box. They're channels for education and for imagination, to be read aloud or quietly, privately, or communally. And through this collection, what I'm hoping to do is question what gets counted as rare, valuable, and collectible. You know, this isn't just a collection of books, but it's an organic archive of Black British activism, which shines a light on the important role of publishing, self-representation, and historical consciousness in the building of communities within hostile environments. What also makes this collection distinct is the coalescing of different Black publishing houses. So whilst the George Padmore Institute, which is located in Finsbury Park above the New Beacon Bookshop, which by the way is still running, and I strongly recommend people visit or order from them online, or the London Metropolitan Archives, which houses the Huntley collections. So the Huntleys were the founders of Bogle Louverture Publications. So in both of these archives, you get kind of full runs of the works published by these publishing houses, but you don't get many books published by other Black publishers. So you kind of, you can see that there are kind of gaps in these different publishers coming together. And even in the British Library's holdings, there are lots of gaps. And this is not only a failure of legal deposit collecting, but it also reflects how institutions often fail Britain's Black communities. Therefore, I think my collection is offering a unique lens onto Black British publishing. And I think it's something that's relevant to anyone and everyone. And these books are reflective of our collective British history and creativity. And they tell a bigger story about migration, race and resistance in post-war Britain. Right, I'm now going, hopefully, to pin this. Ooh. That should be what I did. So I'm just going to show you 4 of, kind of some key books from the collection. And this is actually my favorite book. So this is called Joey Tyson. It's written by Andrew Salkey, and it was published in 1974 by Bogle-L'Ouverture Publications. And so Bogle-L'Ouverture was founded in 1969 as part of a response to the banning of Walter Rodney, who was a renowned Guyanese historian, activist and intellectual who was teaching at the University of the West Indies at the time and then was banned by the Jamaican government. And in response to this, there are kind of mass protests by both students, Rastafarians and the downtown working classes in Kingston, as well as protests in other parts of the Caribbean and in London. And kind of out of this, Bogle-L'Ouverture is founded. And kind of part of this, kind of Jessica Huntley set up a children's series. Jessica is is the founding mother of Bogle-L'Ouverture Publications, and it kind of, Joey Tyson really symbolises the radical educational efforts of this publishing house and of kind of Black publishing more broadly. And the novel is a fictional reconstruction of this 1968 banning of Walter Rodney, and it tells the story of a group of young friends who engage in the protests that break out, with Joey Tyson being the main protagonist. And as you can see from the kind of the cover artwork, young people are very much presented as the agents of change, kind of they're at the kind of forefront of these struggles. And, you know, it's interesting if you think about this book being published in Britain in the 70s, and you kind of have this emerging kind of young Black British generation, and kind of having these books to kind of read and absorb the very important kind of radical histories of the Caribbean, but to kind of absorb that in the British context. And this copy was gifted to me by Eric Huntley, who signed it for me, and it's quite, you know, it's sort of kind of, it's very special to me. And Eric is the husband of Jessica Huntley, and they founded Bogle-L'Ouverture Publications together. The next book I'm going to show you is Minty Alley by the great 20th century historian C.L.R. James, and it's his only novel, and it's a really important reminder of his literary ambitions, but also the literary ambitions of many Caribbean people that journeyed to Britain on a mission to get published. And it's a novel of the yard, and it gives the reader a great insight into working class life in Trinidad. And it's one of New Beacon's earliest and most successful publications. There are some, as you can see, conservation concerns on the sleeve. So it's quite, I always feel like it's quite delicate. And it was originally published, you can see here, in 1936 by Secker and Warburg, which was a sort of left-wing British publishing house that actually published quite a lot of the kind of big key Black radical texts in this period. So they also published the Black Jacobins in the 1930s as well. And so this new 1971 edition, which has an introduction by Kenneth Ramchan, is part of New Beacon's Lost Literature series, which is precisely about kind of trying to kind of bring these books sort of back into the contemporary moment. And as Ramchan writes in the introduction, Mr. James's novel has been out of print for almost 25 years. The present edition offers an opportunity to sketch out some of the continuities in the West Indian literary scene and to introduce a new generation to an important and interesting work by the most distinguished West Indian of our time and his. So why this book is so important to me is, I think, because it's a real insight into this practice of Black British publishers reclaiming classic texts of the Black radical tradition and using the mode of the reprint to not only make these writings accessible, but also to resituate old texts in the contemporary moment by commissioning new introductions. So this is by Andrew Salkey again, in its Georgetown Journal, A Caribbean Writer's Journey from London via Port of Spain to Georgetown, Guyana, 1970. And I love the kind of the style of the font on the cover. And Salkey was a co-founder of the Caribbean Artists Movement in 1966, and he was deeply committed to promoting Caribbean art, folk culture and history, along with his co-founders Kamal Brathwaite and John LaRose being the founder of New Beacon. And as the photograph on the back shows, so we've got Samuel Sullivan, who I'm sure lots of you would have heard of because he wrote the book The Lonely Londoners, which is kind of, incredibly kind of important and well-known novel. And then we have Salkey and John LaRose here on the right. And it very much kind of shows how Salkey is embedded in this diasporic literary network that's really kind of coming to fruition in the post-war period. And in Georgetown Journal, the reader is taken on this journey of a sort of tumultuous and exciting moment in Caribbean history. So in 1970, you have the Caribbean Writers and Artists Conference when the Cooperative Republic of Ghana was founded. And then there's also the Black Power Rebellion that happens in Trinidad in the same year. And Salkey really, he's one of the great diarists of Caribbean life. He's also a really important figure in bringing Caribbean kind of folk stories and folk culture back into popular consumption and knowledge. And the book really is an important artifact of how Caribbean diaspora publishing was not only about kind of telling those histories of what's going on in Britain, but also reflecting on regional transformations and experiences. And then the last book I'll show you is by Buzz Johnson, and it's called I Think of My Mother, Notes on the Life and Times of Claudia Jones. So Claudia Jones is one of the great revolutionary intellectuals of the 20th century. She was born in Trinidad in 1915 before she moved to the USA, and she became a huge figure in the Communist Party before she was then deported and travelled to the UK, where she continues her important work, and she really becomes a beacon for the growing Black British population in the post-war period. And she sets up kind of one of the first main newspapers called the West Indian Gazette. And she's a Marxist, she was a feminist, anti-colonial and anti-racist thinker and activist, but she still really kind of in 2020 is yet to receive her due recognition and appreciation, though there has been some really brilliant scholarship on her in recent years by Carol Boyce Davies. But so at the time of writing this, Buzz Johnson's book is really one of the first books written and published on Jones, and it's published, I think, 20 years after her untimely death. And the book includes biographical notes, tributes to her from the likes of Paul Robeson. I'll just show you. This is her, very beautiful woman. But it also it has an appendix which includes Jones's writing. So I think it includes about 4 essays. So this is an end to the neglect of the problems of Negro women. And Jones is really one of the first people to start thinking about kind of multiple layers of exploitation in terms of being kind of Black, female and working class. And at the time of publishing this, it would have been very hard to kind of to come across her work and writing and thinking. So Buzz Johnson is doing, this is a really kind of critical moment in the historiography of Claudia Jones. And the fact that he designed, wrote and published the book, and he is the founder of Carrier Press, embodies this independent and autonomous character of Black British publishing. Just re-spotlight myself to finish off. I just wanted to take a moment to kind of situate this recent historical collection in the present moment in light of everything that's been unfolding around the Black Lives Matter movement. And I want to take this opportunity to highlight the vital role of books and education in these struggles. And connected to this, the Black Writers Guild wrote a letter calling for sweeping change in UK publishing. And they've made several demands about data access and financial commitment. And it highlights the persistent exclusion of Black voices across the publishing and literary industries. And why this is important is this is precisely what the publishers in my collection have been attempting to challenge and transform since the 1960s. Autonomous, community-based, and often financially independent, these publishers and their publications are the tangible fragments of diasporic communities struggling for recognition and for freedom. Amongst everything that's going on in the world at the moment, these are surely the books that we need people to be reading. These are the books that allow people to dream to change the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Naomi. And those are books that very sadly we're not so likely to find in many traditional libraries, particularly university libraries. And we have a few collections in our small press collections at UCL. And you've been working with the British Library, is that right, in your PhD?
Yeah, I'm doing a collaborative PhD, so I'm also based there. So I spent a lot of time kind of trawling through their collections. They have lots of incredible stuff, but I'm always amazed that actually kind of what big gaps there are. Yeah.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? There is usually material, but first of all, it's not so visible somehow because people don't have the background knowledge or the educational history to look for it. And secondly, it may be not deliberately collected, which is what's so fantastic about your collection. Thank you very much indeed. That's wonderful. So we have now the possibility, if you're rushing off to something at 2 o'clock, you might want to rush off now. Thank you very much for coming, and please do come next week. If you're staying with us, we're going to take questions, and in order to do that, if you move your cursor and look at the bottom of the screen, there's a square speech bubble which says chat. And if you click that, you'll see the chat panel. And so you'll be able to ask your questions now. And if you make sure it's set to everyone, you can do that. Alternatively, if you'd like to speak your question, bear in mind it's going to be recorded, but if you're happy with that, if you click on the participants panel at the bottom of the screen, that will open up the participants panel, and that also gives you the option to raise hand, and we'll be seeing that. And we'll be able to take the virtual microphone over to you. At this stage, I'd like to thank our 2 moderators behind the scenes. That's Helen Biggs, who works to support our academic support and teaching and exhibitions and outreach programs, and Chris Fripp, who is our acting Rare Books librarian at the moment. We've got a lovely comment that says, thank you, it was great. So thank you very much for coming. So while we wait for some questions to come in on the chat or some people to raise their hand, I've got a question for both Naomi and Imogen. It's up to you whether you want to keep your videos on. It might be a bit easier when you're answering questions if you've got enough Wi-Fi to keep your videos on. And in fact, everybody can open their videos if they want to, if they're happy with that, with recording. So you're both collecting things that traditionally in the past probably haven't made their ways into large institutional libraries or collections, and they may not have been collected by private collectors in the past. And I wondered, it's not the case that everything that you're collecting at the moment is rare now, but it may very well become rare in the future, which is why it's so fantastic that you're collecting it now. I wondered if you have any ideas about how to advocate for the importance of what you're collecting so that it becomes, it finds its way more commonly into collections. I don't know, Imogen, do you have any thoughts?
I think probably the biggest problem with the books that I collect is that people kind of tend to think that they're not accessible. The problem with a lot of these old classics is that people don't think that they're necessarily that interesting, or you can get a new copy that's really cheap, which I think is a shame. But I don't quite know. I guess it would just be kind of showing and telling people how these great how you can buy these great books for £1 or £2, and even if you don't read them, they'll still look great on your shelf. I definitely bought quite a lot of these because I thought they looked pretty, as well as because I wanted to read them. But I guess it's just encouraging people to have a look and to buy and to venture into a shop that you might not necessarily go into before, because it's not limits.
Yeah, that's great. And just before I move on to Naomi with the same question, we've got a question which follows up on that quite nicely as 2 parts. Do series such as Collins Clear Type replace yellow backs, or are they aimed at a separate social layer? And then another question which you've just touched on. the person says, I wonder about the significance of the binding decoration as dust jackets become more standardized, and that's true, isn't it?
Yeah, and the problem is with the dust jackets that not many of them survive, so it's quite hard to know whether things would have been the same or different. I mean, whether, because I know a lot of dust jackets were made to be got rid of straight away. They weren't particularly anything special to look at. But I know, of course, some of them would have been. But I guess that, I mean, I don't know too much. This is something I need to look into more and learn. But I think the binding decoration probably would have gone downhill when dust jackets became more pretty themselves. And in terms of Connor's clear type press and yellowbacks, I think they'd have been aimed at slightly different social layers. Because if I'm not wrong, I think yellowbacks were often kind of seen as a bit scandalous, weren't they? Whereas Colin's clear type press, they weren't. They were for everybody. You didn't have to worry about being caught with one, whereas you might be with the yellowbacks.
Certainly, that's how we end up with the Oscar Wilde and Aubrey Beardsley's Yellow Book. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's true that the more decorative bindings are perhaps more likely to be collectible initially because they're more visually appealing. Thank you. So, Naomi, I don't know if you've got any suggestions about how you can, and things like a New Beacon, they are actually available in the market, but it doesn't seem that people are at the moment buying those up and valuing them. Have you got any ideas about how you can, how would you advocate for the importance of what you're collecting? I mean, it seems self-evident to this audience.
Yeah.
But more widely.
I would say, I think, you know, these books probably, they are being collected and they are considered important kind of within certain communities. It's about like, how do we make that shift to it being seen as kind of something that is important to kind of everyone, and that it's part of, you know, it really is part of British history rather than it being sort of cast off to sort of exist in its own realm. And I don't feel like I, you know, need to say much to sort of advocate or sell the content of the books, but I can see that if you're someone that's kind of into collecting, you know, kind of special or rare books, I think the fact that most of these books are paperbacks might be kind of off-putting, even though the fact that they're paperbacks is precisely a part of that kind of radical publishing project about making books as accessible as possible. But that actually, they have such kind of amazing artwork on them. So there was a Joey Tyson one, I've got another one. Here's Valerie Bloom poetry book. But that kind of, it's not just the content, it's also the book, the physicality of the books themselves, and the kind of different representations that these books give you, especially I think, you know, of kind of Black children, and really important kind of artworks and front covers that were doing something incredibly radical in the 60s and 70s, which is, you know, yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I'm being disingenuous because we just spent 15 minutes giving the most wonderful advocacy for these collections, but you're right, there is a sort of jump that we need to, a bridge we need to make from the kind of audience where we are to really make sure that institutions start to collect it. Interestingly enough, just this last week, here in Special Collections, we've had a meeting to see how we can support UCL's program, which is called Liberating the Curriculum, to try to come up with some ideas for highlighting the Black British writers that we already have in the collection, and also to try to make sure that those items are emphasised in the collection items we use in teaching, that we use in exhibitions, and if we ever have any money to collect more material, which sadly doesn't often happen, that's a priority as well. If we can get those kinds of programs really out there more widely, that would be
But I think that's also one of the benefits, because these books are not judged as particularly valuable or kind of worthwhile by lots of sections of society. they're incredibly cheap to get hold of, lots of these books. You know, you can buy them for kind of a few pounds online, which is kind of quite amazing to me, because, you know, in my head, they're incredibly valuable books. And they're out of print books, and they are actually, you know, lots of them are quite rare and are in short supply. But that does mean, yeah, that even kind of the accessibility that was always intended when these books were initially produced kind of carries on in the kind of accessibility of collecting them.
Yeah, absolutely. It does at the moment. Let's hope that we can get them more valued. Just quickly, because it's coming up to 2 o'clock, we've got a question for Imogen, which says, do you know in what ways your popular editions differ from earlier, and then in quotation marks, fancier editions? Yours are still beautiful, but I'm sure there must have been some cost-cutting measures somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. I wish I had it in this room, but I do have a big edition of William Thackeray works, which I'll just kind of describe it to you. So whereas we have this Colin one, which is quite small, the Thackeray is much bigger and much chunkier, and kind of just generally it feels a lot more solid. That sounds a bit odd to say, but I mean, it's a lot thicker with the actual kind of covering here. And although these ones do have a bit of decoration on and gilding, they're much more substantial. The William Thackeray has a big kind of WT motif in the middle, and kind of more embossing around the edge to decorate it with. And then I do have another earlier one as well, which is by a anonymous writer, which has a picture on the front, and again gold lettering on the actual cover with the title and things. So just kind of more decoration and more embossing, I guess, and again bigger. I think, well, that's the most obvious difference: bigger and chunkier.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. And we've got a question in the chat as well, which says, I think this is for Naomi. Thank you so much for both introductions to these book collections. A question for Naomi. I'd love to know more about how you have come across the publishers and writers that you're collecting, and how you identify other authors and publishers which are connected to your collection.
So part of how I've kind of come across these publishers is through my thesis research, which looks at Caribbean diaspora publishing in Britain. It's also through my dad, who is a book distributor, because I've kind of quite a lot of the books in the collection have come from him. But I think it just goes to show the importance of publishing, the fact that kind of really any study of Black activism in the post-war period, it's kind of impossible not to come across these publishing figures, because they really are kind of at the forefront of these political struggles. So I think, yeah, that's kind of the main way that I come into contact with them. Yeah, and I'm always looking to kind of identify publishers and writers that I haven't heard of. And yeah, and I'm not for my thesis research, but for the collection, thinking about more contemporary publishers as well.
Now it's coming up to 2 o'clock. If anybody has to go, we do have a feedback form, and the link is in the chat. And we'd be really pleased if you could do that. I have a feeling, I might be wrong, is somebody called Kathy, are you wanting to ask a question without it in the chat? But you'll need to click on the microphone button at the bottom left so that we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I wasn't quite sure how to navigate chat. Two very engaging presentations. I wanted to ask Naomi a question. I could feel the passion that you have with your subject, and I wondered, how has your engagement with this work made an impact on you? What challenged you? What made you grow? What inspired you?
Thank you. Yeah, I do feel incredibly passionate about it, and I think I'm continually kind of growing as I'm engaging with these histories through these books, and also through kind of some of the voluntary work that I do of actually getting to meet the people that are involved in these movements, and always feeling like I have a kind of a duty and a responsibility to kind of, in my, you know, privileged position, you know, being a PhD student as well, of making sure that I can kind of promote these histories as much as possible. And I think because it's, you know, such a vast, like, broad collection of not only historical works, but poetry and fiction, that it's quite a kind of, I don't know if spiritual is the right word, but it's quite a kind of emotional engagement with these histories. And
so, sort of like it's your calling.
Yeah, so, yeah. In some ways, yeah, maybe, yeah. It's a nice way to think of it.
That's great. That was a lovely question. And it's really, I think, something for all of the people, all the 64 people who entered this competition, to think about what makes them relate to this material that they're collecting, but particularly in the case of such an important collection here. Thank you very much, Kathy. We've got one more question in the chat. Thank you both for your great presentations. I have a question for Naomi. Have you thought about collecting more ephemeral material, like pamphlets or newspapers?
Yes, definitely. And Tabitha, you'll know this is something that came up quite a lot in the interview. And I'm really interested in ephemeral material. The problem is it's quite hard to collect. And I guess, that's just the nature of kind of ephemera. People throw away newspapers and flyers, but there are some amazing collections of ephemeral material in places like the Huntley Archives, at the London Metropolitan Archives, and at the George Padmore Institute. And if anyone has any tips on how to kind of get my hands on material like this, yeah, send them my way.
Anyone got any tips out there? Fantastic. So I think that's all the questions for the time being. If you have any further questions that we don't have time to answer now, you can get in touch with us, and the email address is in the chat section now. library.spec.col.aca@ucl.ac.uk, or if that's too long to remember, spec.col@ucl.ac.uk, or it's on our UCL Special Collections website. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, but fantastic thank you to Imogen and to Naomi for 2 really superb presentations, and we wish you all the best in your collecting. A huge thank you also to Anthony Davis for setting up this prize and for encouraging you and all of the 64 people in the competition for starting out to collect these physical materials, because without you, we will not have our history and not have our culture to preserve for the future. So thank you, everybody. Please join us next week for 19th century bindings.